Hello, scholars. Welcome. It's me, your history teacher, Mr. Denny. This is my e-learning classroom. All right, we're going to continue talking about the civil rights movement. We were listening to Funkadelic just then. I'll post a link below somewhere in the haiku if you want to listen to that song. You should have your lecture notes out. I have them for you in a Google Doc. Remember, you don't have to email me to ask for permission. Just go to the top left, I think, and then File, Save a Copy. Now you have a brand new copy. You can type in it. Of course, you can always print it out. You can reference it. You can just write notes on your own notebook paper. If that's how you like to do it. Whatever works best for you. So we're going to continue talking about the civil rights movement. We're specifically going to focus on the leaders of the civil rights movement and try to figure out what were the approaches and kind of what was the effectiveness of those approaches. By the end of this lesson, we should be able to evaluate Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Malcolm X's success in the civil rights movement. So we're going to just kind of start with some background information here. First, starting with Martin Luther King Jr. So he's born in 1929 to sharecroppers. He's born in Atlanta in 1929. He attends Morehouse University as well as Boston University, so he's extremely well educated, and his background is primarily in ministry. He also goes to theological school after those two universities, right? So he's extremely well credentialed, but his background here is in ministry and activism. And he's going to go on to become a non-violent leader in the civil rights movement from about 1955 to 1968. He's heavily influenced not only by his Christian faith, but also by the works of Henry David Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi. Huge range of influences there. And those influences kind of lead him towards this kind of theory of unity, of non-violent protest, specifically by Gandhi. Gandhi in India advocated the use of non-violent protesting, that you can resist unjust laws, but you don't have to strike out, right? That you can kind of promote peace even in your resistance. There we go. So his kind of spotlight as a civil rights leader really begins with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. So it starts off with Rosa Parks, who's pictured here. Starts off with Rosa Parks refusing to get up from the whites only section on the bus, and this eventually leads the African American community in the South, led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, to organize a boycott of the entire Montgomery, Alabama bus system. So they actively just stopped riding the buses, right? And so through this boycott, they kind of showed the economic power that the African American community had, and this eventually leads to the desegregation or integration, right? Desegregation and integration are like the same word, of the bus system. We also see the emergence of a group called the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is a civil rights group that Martin Luther King Jr. starts. And really the keystone of the Montgomery bus boycott is that the Supreme Court declares that the bus system must be desegregated. That segregation of the bus systems, that's unconstitutional, which if we think back to Brown v. Board of Education, if we think back to that kind of that legal opinion that had changed and formed since Plessy v. Ferguson, we see that this is kind of an inevitable thing, that the tides are eventually going to turn for the civil rights movement. From the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr.'s next stop is with what's called the Birmingham Campaign. And so we see kind of two vocal opponents of not only Martin Luther King Jr., but also the whole civil rights movement in general. Martin Luther King Jr. targeted Birmingham because he felt like this was the most segregated city in the United States. We have the governor of Alabama, George Wallace. He adamantly supports segregating the races. He's quoted as saying, "I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." We also have Eugene Conner, aka Bull Connor, and he is in charge of the police forces there, and he's in charge of suppressing those peaceful protesters, those people who are with Martin Luther King Jr. He's there to use high-pressure hoses, attack dogs, nightsticks, jailing peaceful protesters who are there to do sit-ins and protests. So we see these two vocal opponents of Martin Luther King Jr.'s kind of civil disobedience approach. And they really kind of put that to the test. However, Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists, they still fight on. Many of them are arrested for protesting this treatment. And here we're beginning to see the violence against African Americans not only increase, but also become more publicized. We see these photos here. Let me move my little icon out of the way. We see these photos here of just how brutal, how cruel the government was responding to the protesters. But these photographs kind of go on and publicize, here's what's going on in the South. And it puts some real pressure on the South, specifically Alabama, to fall in line with what the federal government has said, right? Remember, the Supreme Court has said you have to get rid of segregation, right? So we see here segregation is still enforced in spite of what Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists are doing. And eventually Martin Luther King Jr. is jailed for his actions. And it's in this jail cell that he actually writes he has a lot of really influential writings, but one of his most influential writings, Letter from Birmingham Jail. He was writing to a newspaper while he was in jail, and he was basically discussing the abuses that were being faced by African Americans in the South, as well as the need for change. I've got an excerpt here where he insisted that I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. So what's he saying there? He's really kind of defending his position of civil disobedience, defending nonviolence, saying that, look, we feel that these laws of segregation that Alabama has put forth, we feel these are unjust. But we are going to show that in the highest, most respectful way possible, and that is by willingly accepting the penalties, accepting the consequences of that disobedience, right? And so in that way, he's not only showing respect for the law, but also being true to himself, being true to his principles, being true to his values. And he's going to kind of show that throughout his career, throughout his time as an activist. So that's 1963. Where do we go from there? 1963 also sees the March on Washington. You'll remember over 100,000 people show up on Washington. They were worried that people weren't going to attend. That also sees the iconic "I Have a Dream" speech on future racial integration, his vision for the future of white and black working together in harmony in a society. Martin Luther King Jr., you might remember when we talked about Vietnam, is Martin Luther King Jr. also felt that Vietnam was distracting from the civil rights movement here at home. Martin Luther King Jr., remember, he's against violence, and that includes wars as well. So he was against the Vietnam War. He said all those resources, all that time, all that energy, that should be here helping the poor in the United States versus the Vietnamese in one way or another during the Vietnam War. Ultimately, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated by a guy named James Earl Ray in April 1968. And as a response to his assassination, riots erupt across the United States in spite of Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent teachings, except for one city, which we'll revisit. So that's Martin Luther King Jr. He's nonviolent, civil disobedience. You can break the rules, but you have to be willing to accept the consequences. You cannot lash out at those who are oppressing you. That it's better to kind of maintain that dignity and show how you feel about those unjust laws. Martin Luther King Jr. Contrast that, right, with Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is originally born Malcolm Little. Malcolm X is not his original name. Malcolm Little in 1925. He moves to Harlem, New York. While he's there, he engages in drug dealing, gambling, racketeering, robbery. So he kind of struggles at the beginning to find some direction. He is sent to prison for 8 years, and while he's in prison, he discovers this religion called the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam was a relatively new religious movement at the time. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. But while he's in prison, he discovers this religion and discovers the writings of its leader, Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam. And while he's in prison, he actually writes a letter to President Truman at the time, talking about how he was against the Korean War. And in the letter, he also declared himself a communist. And it's actually from this point forward that Malcolm X was already being tracked by the FBI. We should also add Martin Luther King Jr., also being tracked by the FBI, right? The civil rights movement, from the government's perspective, was seen as like this scary, destabilizing force, right? So let's talk a little bit more about Nation of Islam. How does that play into Malcolm X's influence? If you see me looking down, by the way, I'm just looking down at my notes there. So Nation of Islam, it was a relatively new religious movement, and it was all about black self-reliance, as well as the eventual return of African Americans to Africa. So it's about black self-reliance, not necessarily about integration, right? Not about white and black working together, but about the kind of superiority of the African American race, how they should not depend on the government for civil rights, that they inherently have civil rights, and if they're not being recognized, then you need to go take them. So while learning about this, Malcolm Little, by the way, see, still using his original name at this point. At this point, he concludes that, you know what, the Nation of Islam is making some good points. All of his relationships up to that point had been kind of tainted by dishonesty, injustice, greed, and hatred. And with the discovery of the Nation of Islam, this is where he changes his last name from Little to X to mark the lost last name that was taken from him when African Americans were brought here through slavery. And he eventually becomes a minister in the Nation of Islam, right? So let me move my icon there. So we see a Nation of Islam church there in the bottom right. This one's actually in Chicago. So it's here. He's becoming a minister in the Nation of Islam. So what is his rise then like? Because so far, you know, he's a minister. Martin Luther King Jr. is a minister. What's that like? Well, Malcolm X, he begins to outshine the leader, Elijah Muhammad. And there's this kind of growing kind of dislike of Malcolm X within the religion, because Malcolm X is kind of quickly gaining fame. He's very well spoken. He's also like, he's a pretty handsome guy. He was like 6'3", 180 pounds. And like he quickly becomes very famous as a leader. And so take that with Malcolm X's feeling that he was reaching the ceiling of what he could do within the Nation of Islam. He felt like it was too strictly confined. So Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam and he takes a journey to Mecca, which in the religion of Islam is kind of a requirement, is to go to Mecca. And when he's there, during his travels, he sees races converging in harmony. He begins to see and speak about interracial cooperation, right? So that's a big move. That's a big change. Because before, he initially felt the races could never work together. A nonviolent struggle is going to fail. That Martin Luther King Jr., like, he has a dream, but that's really all it can be. And so now Malcolm X is starting to change his position that the races can work together. But he always promoted self-reliance for the black community. He felt like African Americans did still need to gain political and economic control. And so when he starts to veer away from the teachings of the Nation of Islam, then he starts to kind of also gain enemies along with that. And so 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated by multiple gunmen from the Nation of Islam. They weren't sent there. They were associated with it. A lot of controversy still to this day. But we see that Malcolm X definitely had a different perspective on civil rights compared to Martin Luther King Jr., right? Malcolm X is more about direct action. If you don't have civil rights, if they're not being recognized, then it's your right to take them. He's about if someone's going to attack you, if someone is going to, try to arrest you or something, well, then you're in the right to defend yourself, right? So Malcolm X differs on Martin Luther King Jr. there, but we saw that Malcolm X kind of near the end started to see what Martin Luther King Jr. Was going for. So what is the government's response then? Well, JFK's response during all of this is that he was trying to slowly introduce change, which for the civil rights leaders was too slow. Regardless, JFK did have a lot of influence with Martin Luther King Jr., advising him, and also vice versa. And especially after the riots in Birmingham, especially after Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington, we see that the government starts to kind of feel forced to make some moves, to make some changes. So that's JFK's response. He was trying to slowly introduce that change. What about RFK? Robert F. Kennedy's response, right? So JFK's brother. Well, RFK was kind of more openly supportive of Martin Luther King Jr. He sent U.S. Marshals and the National Guard to make sure that Martin Luther King Jr. would be safe at various protests. He personally arranged for King to be released from a jail in Atlanta after Martin Luther King Jr. was staging a sit-in. And he was also in Indianapolis when news of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death was first released. So RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, was campaigning for president in 1968, and he gives this speech on the spot, and I'll give a link to it in the haiku, but he gives this speech on the spot, talking about how we need to remain peaceful, that we can't break out in violence. So I said before at the beginning, riots broke out in 60 cities after King's death, but not in Indianapolis. A lot of people say it's because of what Robert Kennedy said there in that speech. We talked in a previous lecture about how 1968 was a really kind of rocky, sad, crazy year. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, you'll remember, both assassinated in 1968. A little bit of history here in our hometown, though, Indianapolis. And that is the Martin Luther King Jr. and Kennedy Landmark for Peace. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you've seen pictures of it. Maybe you've seen it in real life. But here we have both of them kind of grasping, trying to... my chair almost broke. Trying to make changes. So if you want to go to that, I think you're allowed. It feels essential to me. It's for school. But if you want to go, there's the address. You can go make a little day trip out of it. Make sure you stay 6 feet away from the nearest person. So finally, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. What is his stance? What is his response to the civil rights movement? Well, here we're beginning to see some substantive things. For one, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally prohibits discrimination in those private businesses like restaurants and hotels. We also see... It's going to load. There we go. The 24th Amendment passed, which bans poll taxes. We remember that was used to hurt African Americans in their voting rights. The South was instituting a tax, a fee in order to vote, so that gets rid of that. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act ends literacy tests, and now the federal government is going to officially be monitoring elections to ensure fairness, to ensure equal access. And that's something that still kind of plays a role today. And then finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 makes discrimination in housing illegal, right? So during LBJ's presidency, we kind of see the efforts of these leaders of the civil rights movement kind of come to fruition, and they kind of, we see the results of these protests. So with that, we are going to take a look at some different quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., from Malcolm X. I want to see if we can identify the differences in their ideologies, in their approaches. So I'm going to put a quote up here, and I want you guys to pause it, read the quote, and I want you to see if you can tell me basically what is it trying to say, right? Try to use those annotation skills, and then also try to tell me who do you think said this quote? Who do you think this quote is from? So go ahead, pause the video. I'll try to move my little icon guy out of the way, but pause the video and read it, and then see if you can guess who it's going to be. Okay, you've paused the video, you've read through it. Let's do this one together. So the subject here is on the role of whites in the civil rights movement, right? So basically, like, can they work together for a common goal? So we see here, another group with a vital role to play in the present crisis is the white Northern liberals. So let's pause there. So already this quote is saying that that whites have an important role to play, right? That they have a purpose here. The racial issue which we confront in America is not a sectional, but a national problem. The citizenship rights of Negroes cannot be flouted anywhere without impairing the rights of every American. Injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. Maybe that quote jumped out to you. Maybe you've heard that before. We've already got some ideas about who this might be. Breakdown of law in Alabama. Pause right there. Alabama, we remember someone was in Alabama. Someone was protesting in Alabama. Weakens the very foundations of lawful government in the other 47 states. The mere fact that we live in the United States means that we are caught in a network of inescapable mutuality. Therefore, no American can afford to be apathetic about the problem that meets every man in his front door. Let's pause right there. Therefore, no American can afford to be apathetic. No one can afford to just not care. Right? This is a problem that affects everyone in the United States. And so if this is a problem that affects everyone, then that means that we need to come together. We need to approach this, attack this issue together. The racial problem will be solved in America to the degree that every American considers himself personally confronted with it. Whether one lives in the heart of the Deep South or in the North, the problem of injustice is his problem. It is his problem because it is America's problem. So here, when we read this, this is very inclusive. It's bringing everyone in. It's talking about how this is an issue for everyone that we need to solve together. And so if you read one of these passages, one of these quotes, and the word togetherness and unity is coming into your head as a country, I want you to think of who? Martin Luther King Jr., right? So this is a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. He was in Alabama. Maybe you've seen that quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. But the ideas here are very, very Martin Luther King Jr., right? Let's go to another quote on the same issue. Maybe you already have an idea about who this might be from. I don't know. But again, pause the video, take a look at the quote. Even if you know who it is, I want you to be able to say how you know, right? What are the clues in this quote that lead you to that ideology? Pause it. Take a read. Okay, you've paused it, you've read it, same subject. Let's see what it says. Brothers, the white man can't give you the solution. All right, let's just pause right there. Very divisive, right? It's already right off the bat saying, brothers, the white man can't give you the solution. So one, that tells us who the audience is, right? He's probably not saying this to a predominantly white audience. He isn't. He's also saying that we should not be looking to the white population of society for answers. He goes on to say, you will never get the solution from any white liberal. Don't let them come in and tell you what we should do to solve the problem. Those days are over. They can't do it, and they won't do it. That's like asking the fox to help you solve the problem confronting the wolf. He'll give you a solution that will put you right in his clutches, and this is what the white liberal does. very seldom you will find whites who can in any way put up with black nationalists. He just can't stomach it. But he can go along with anything that is integrated because he knows he can get in there and finagle it and have you walking backwards thinking you'll be walking forwards. Okay, so here we see that the speaker is making an argument that it is up to ourselves to reach a solution, to find an answer, that we cannot rely on the white population for any answers, and that if you come across someone who is white, who seems to be wanting to work with you, you should not trust them, because he's going to have you walking backwards thinking that you're going to be walking forwards, right? So we've got themes of self-reliance, of working solely within your own race, within your own population. We see a distrust of the white population. Those are some elements there. Who's that probably from? This quote is going to be from Malcolm X, right? Again, a lot of little flags here that show us that this is Malcolm X's ideology. All right. So I've got some more quotes for you in the Google form link. If you feel like you want a little bit more of a refresher, a little bit more enforcement about the views, I'll put some links to speeches from Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Malcolm X in the haiku. But your assignment is to try out the other quotes for yourself in the Google form. You're going to tell me a summary of the quote in just like one sentence, and then you're going to have to make sure you know who that quote is from. Can you identify the speaker? All right. Stay scholarly, keep learning. I am proud of all of you. See ya.